Awesome. Good morning, everyone. We'll get started. So we're very happy to have Johannes Eckstad. So Johannes is a faculty in the Department of Psychology here at Stanford. He's also a junior fellow in the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence.
Sriram Faculty Fellow.
Yeah. Sriram Faculty Fellow, that's right. So he's doing a lot of really interesting work, connecting social network, text analysis with health, also with COVID. And he's also been a fantastic mentor to a couple of groups of students as a part of this class here. So we are very happy and excited to have him speak to the class today and to give a presentation on measuring mental physical health using social media.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Did the screen sharing work? Yeah? Okay, screen is shared. Okay. Pleasure to be here. I want to today talk a little bit about what we can do with social media to understand psychological processes, and do this for individuals and do this for populations. So why do we care about social media data in the social sciences? Well, it's a whole lot of data, right? So it's a large fraction of the world population. It's probably more than half that is now on social media. It's the largest longitudinal and cross-sectional data set in human history, right? So we have to the order of thousands of words from something like 3 to 4 billion people. And most of it is text. Of course, there's different modalities with TikTok and places like Instagram, of course. But most of it still continues to be text, or can be mined in text fashion, say through transcription. So how do we analyze language? Well, here's just a sort of super quick primer. From the psychological view, we extract features, language features. So we take the unstructured text data, the strings, and we turn it into some kind of statistical representation of language features. And there's a number of traditional models. So this the standard way that's been used since the 1960s is using dictionaries, things like linguistic inquiry and word count, where you simply count words in different categories and describe dictionary scores for the text as fractions of words that occur within the given dictionary. You can look at the words and phrases themselves if you're sufficiently powered. You can look at concepts, so you can do slightly more sophisticated parsing. You can also bring in what's called ontologies, external knowledge, graphs. You can do a number of clustering methods in the language space to reduce. So the standard vocabulary is to the order of about 30,000 words. That's a very high dimensional space to be searching in, and a number of methods have evolved to factor analyze this down, reduce the dimensionality of the space. So we have topics, and then in the form of LDA topics, they're sort of the grandfather of the topic field. This is an example of latent Dirichlet allocation topics, LDA topics. You see that these are clusters of coherently semantic words that co-occur in contexts. So the metric here is co-occurrence that makes them that clusters them together. Similar idea for embeddings. Embeddings, there's vector embeddings, and now there's contextual embeddings in the case of BERT. They also look at the company that words tend to keep. It's the distributional hypothesis that the meaning of words is in part defined by the company they keep. And that's captured with embedding methods. This is a machine learning based methods to extract the contexts that occur around words. And just to give you an order of magnitude here, dictionaries are order 100, words and phrases are often order 10,000. Topics, we generally, when we do the sort of exploration in the language space, generally work order 1,000. Embeddings are generally, depends on what you use, word to vec is sort of 200 to 300, which is a vector embedding, which have solid embeddings that don't change. They get pre-trained and then you use them. And then if you use something like BERT, you're often sort of order of 1,768 or so dimensions, depending which model you use. These are all pre-trained on very, very big data sets by very, very big companies. And so if you just look at this space, right, so we have roughly social media data sets with more than 1,000 people, and we have more than 1,000 variables per person. And so we're in the general data space of natural language processing and machine learning. And if you're interested for more precise guidelines, we're in the late phases of publishing a pretty involved power calculation for what kind of language methods you can use for what kind of data set. So the questions I try to address today is how can we use this data space to understand and differentiate psychological constructs? How can we measure them using machine learning? And how can we scale the application to prevention and informed policy? And the latter part is something that we've been working on here with student teams in the context of adherence and COVID. I'll actually not talk too much about this because I want the students to, when the time comes, to present their own results rather than scoop them up and present them here. So here's the rough outline of the talk. I'm going to talk about personality, individual, community level, very new stuff, depression, heart disease. I'm going to talk a little bit for well-being for policy, and then I'm going to do a quick sort of talk a little bit about Twitter scraping, Twitter data, and also how to work with county data. So this is a pretty extensive overview talk, and at some point I will stop, I promise. So here's the general pipeline. So we have people. For these people, we have demographic and survey variables. From these people, we also have Facebook language. Of course, we consent every person individually. There's a whole side story here, but of course we have the Facebook authorization, then we have informed consent in the case of Facebook. Twitter, we're generally free to scrape without informed consent because it's considered public anyway. Instagram is sort of in between, but we also do Instagram data collection with informed consent and Reddit data collection. But you generally go through this informed consent process. And companies like Facebook are just rethinking a little bit how we can make this more intelligent in conjunction with the research community. They've been sort of cool lately. So let's say we have these Facebook statuses. We've extracted word frequencies. We have demographic and survey variables, and we can do something as simple as correlate every single word. We control the significance threshold for the 10,000s of comparisons. It's sort of the language equivalent of doing a genome-wide association study, where you simply test everything and then tailor the significance thresholds just for the immense number of tests you run. So, and if you're sufficiently powered, this works fairly well. So this is the language of women on social media. And the visualization I use throughout here are these differential word clouds. They're not ideal, but they're the best way that we know how to show this data. Importantly, the size here is the correlation. So the larger the word, the more predictive the language feature is of being female. So it's not a Wordle cloud where the size indexes frequency. Frequency is here captured in the color, from gray rarely to red very frequently. Of note, things can be both very rare and highly predictive of a particular trait. And we'll see this later in the talk when we get to traits that are not socially desirable. Generally, expressions of them tend to be rare, but when they occur, they're highly predictive. So just as a sort of interesting side note, note that the word boyfriend and hubby occurs here in the language of women. This is the language of men. Much more disagreeable, much more cursing. You see a lot of sports. Video games, COD is Call of Duty. I don't think I have to tell you that, but sometimes I have to tell my audiences. And then note that what our algorithms pulled out here is that the phrases my wife and my girlfriend are more predictive of being male than merely mentioning girlfriend and wife. So this is just a 0th order finding from these open analyses, is that men tend to throw these possessive terms around their relational terms, whereas women don't tend to do this.
We have a question from Daniel.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm a little bit curious about how the biases and the input data are being controlled for, because it seems like a lot of these words are coming from younger folks, right?
So we could, right. So thanks for asking. So we have age as a covariate in these models. So all of this is the features are first regressed on age, and then the leftover effect here is attributed to gender. And in the subsequent analyses, when I show you personality, we control for both age and gender. The major bias here in the data set is that it's data from 2009 to 2011. So it's a little bit outdated, and you sort of, you see a snapshot here of internet culture that's 10 years old. And the sample is also age restricted. It sort of peters out at 35. So you get a lot less resolution in the nuance towards later life phases. And we've written a separate development paper about this, about how language changes as a function of age. I should say, though, that even in a data set that is skewed towards younger populations, this data set has 75,000 people in it. So that means you have fewer people in higher age groups, but we have people in this data set all the way up to 65, I think.
Is there any concern for like the older age groups that they tend to be of a particular population because they are involved in media?
Yeah, you have these cohort effects that we worried about, exactly, right? So the kind of person that is 65 and on a Facebook is probably not randomly sampled from the distribution of 65-year-olds. We were surprised in that regard. We pulled out these different language trends over age and compared it to the literature, and what we found was very, very congruent with even a number of sort of more nuanced psychological theories associated with aging. For example, the aging positivity effect, that older people begin to develop a bias towards pleasant experiences, positive experiences. So we captured that in the data. But yes, this is cross-sectional data that has lots of cohort effects in it. But that's, that's the limiting constraint on all correlational research.
Thank you.
Sure, yeah, and I mean, I can talk more about this later. We're now building up cohorts, so we're following people over time to get better traction on some of these temporal pieces. So it's not just all flatten the temporal dimension, all these analyses, or covary it out, right, as it is. So, so now that we've built the statistical representation that I showed you, right, we can encode this in a machine learning model and a supervised model. It can be as simple as just extract these topic models. By the way, we prefer the mallet package as for making the best topics. We've tried a number of them, and then putting them in some penalized regression framework. It can be rich, it can be random forests. They all do roughly the same. So we take...
Not everyone in the class might be familiar with topic model. Could you maybe just say one more sentence about what are these topic models?
Yeah. Let me think where this comes up next in the talk, and if I can do a principled introduction. No, I think, okay, so if you feel we should do this, then let me go back to these slides here. So these are topics. Topic models is a generative method. So it assumes a structured representation. It goes through this to this biconvex optimization, where you take an input of text and you say, hey, can you find me the number of K topics such that every word occurrence, other than a list of stop words, so highly frequent words which topic models ignore, every word occurrence in these documents is mapped onto a topic, and thus every topic is mapped to a document. So you take as input the set of documents and the co-occurrence, the natural co-occurrence of language. A document here, say, is Facebook status. It's a generic term for just a chunk of text. And then the output of the topic modeling process is the distribution of words within topics and the distribution of topics within documents. This is akin to factor analysis. If you ever worked with factor analysis in the social sciences, you end up with question items loading on factors, and your people have given you item responses to surveys, and now you have the factor scores of people, right? So you turn items times people into people times factors and factors times items. And in that factor representation, you captured something intelligent about the covariance of the items that allows you to make meaning. It's a very similar idea here. You cluster based on semantic proximity, on being part of the same semantic field. I hope this was somewhat helpful. Okay, so back to the main story here. So we have personality, we have gender, right? So now we can predict gender. We have Facebook statuses from people. We can apply this language prediction model, and we can test this against held out data. So the self-reported gender of people, we can compare our predictions against the gender that our models predict. In this case, it's 92%. you can quibble over the exact method. It's somewhere between 90 and 94%. It's basically a solved problem. Gender prediction from social media text is something that there isn't much innovation anymore. We're beginning to max out the baselines. And here, this is a learning curve. How much information do you need to make these estimates? Note that after 20 statuses, you're already at about 80% accuracy at making the call. Yeah, and so getting psychologically a little bit richer. So gender was just in case you're not following the narrative here. I just wanted to show you the methods on something that's pretty straightforward. So let's do this with Big Five personality. Big Five personality is about as close as psychology has come to having a standard model. It's certainly something that people agree on. Well, academics never agree, but to the extent that academics agree on the Big Five in psychology. There's Hexaco, there's more modern frameworks, but it's been an incredibly successful model. So it outpredicts this beautiful paper called The Power of Personality. You can see that Big Five personality traits outpredict parent socioeconomic status and all these other very, very strong predictors of life outcomes. It's a very, very good thing to know about somebody, and it's much better than the Myers-Briggs, which is psychometrically invalid. But that's a commentary for another day. So this is the language of extraversion. Note that the single most predictive feature here is the word party. That's what psychologists call face valid. Notice that the phrase can't wait doesn't have an apostrophe because the person couldn't wait. The implication here being that extraversion is the tendency to seek out social rewards, and it also has a component with impulsivity and reward seeking. So this is your sort of slightly aroused person in the psychological sense, in the affective sense, slightly aroused emotions. That's very socially oriented. This is openness to experience. Openness to experience is if we have the one trait that we're probably all aligned on in the audience is this: openness to experience is a need for cognition. It has an intellect piece, it has an artistic piece. Note here that the most significant feature is the word universe. It's the most predictive here, but it's rarely used, right? But it's sort of your artsiness. And then these personality dimensions also have facets. And in the case of openness, this is particularly instructive. So these are 4 facets that are covered in the survey. It's liberalism. Right, so zombie and rights, imagination, lots of fantasy lore, artistic interests, single most predictive feature being art, music, and drawing, and intellect, often the. Why often the? Well, because those are complex sentence constructions. The more offs and the there are in your language, the longer and more complex and more nuanced your language construction. And I think these are syntactic features, right? So language can be separated into sort of syntactic features, sometimes called function words, and more semantic features, sometimes called content words. And one of the reasons we'll see here in a second why openness can be predicted so well from language, I think, is because it draws so much on syntactic features that are just so present in language, and that computers actually do a much better job of attending to than we do, because we are designed to ignore the syntactic scaffolding of language and see the semantics. Are you with me so far? Yeah, I think so. Thank you, Irina. So this is neuroticism. Neuroticism is the opposite of emotional stability. It's irritability. It's a tendency to experiencing negative emotions, being irritable, being anxious, being depressed. You see that words like depression and depressed are present in the correlational field here. They tend to be rarely used. In part, this is also due to something that we noticed particularly on platforms like Facebook in terms of how signal is distorted. So let me say a little more about this. This always sort of comes up in people's minds around this point in the talk. So aren't people just putting on a face on Facebook? Well, yes and no, right? So there are 2 things that we've seen that are suppressed in terms of signal. It's negative emotion. So the absence, so American culture sort of has a historically a positivity bias, an idea that that we are desirable when we're happy, right? And so when people are unhappy, they tend to post less about it. The other thing we see suppressed variance on is negative forms of achievement. So if people experience failures, they tend to post less about it. And if you think about it in terms of the sort of American myth, the Protestant work ethic, being unsuccessful is sort of also not desirable, just in the sort of morality of American culture. So failure and negative emotions tend to be the dimensions we see suppressed signal on. What do I mean by suppressed signal? Well, it's not that some people post these things and others don't. It seems to be more that that kind of variance is compressed from everyone. Everybody is less likely to post these things to an extent that seems roughly similar across personality traits. We certainly haven't found any big interactions between these social desirability biases and personality traits. I should say that something that's sometimes overlooked is that the friends on Facebook are your real friends, or at least contain a subset of your real friends. And so you are interacting with your social graph, with your actual social graph. And I think there's an element of sharing on Facebook that is certainly constrained by the social norms of sharing in real life, in part because you know that some of the people reading it will be people who actually know you.
Quick question from Sharon.
Yeah, I was curious about how these personality words change with language or region, if you've looked at that yet.
Yeah, that comes up later. So there's two ways we've thought about this. So there's regional variation in language use. I got back to that in the second part of this talk. And then there's something called semantic drift. Semantic drift is the tendency of language to change, to morph over time as a function of different memes, different norms, changing implications, connotations of words. I should say that personality is relatively stable over time, but there's going to be some stability calculations coming up here in a little bit as well. So I think I'll say more then.
Thank you.
So to close this out, so this is agreeableness. Agreeableness is the trait that has the strongest association with subjective well-being in people. And you might see why. Yes, so if this is what's inside of your head, then you can see how this predisposes you towards positive experiences, connection with other people. Notice that there's also a lot of religious language here. Prayers, cries, pray, worship, which in part might be a reflection of being agreeable, which is sort of also has an element of norm compliance in a predominantly religious culture. And outside of urban clusters, the US is 90% Christian. It's a fairly Christian country, to be clear. This is conscientiousness. Conscientiousness continues to be the best predictor of future performance in any professional role or job, which, if I'm not mistaken, also Google realized when they checked a lot of much more sophisticated predictors from their people analytics people. It's the tendency to be cognitively structured, to have lots of temporal structure, to respond to emails, right? This is the person that gets back to your emails and hands things in on time. What we thought was cool here is they don't just seem to schedule their uptime, but also their downtime. So there's scheduling here about weekends, about workouts, and so forth. And this might be part of the recipe why conscientious people tend to be, all things being equal, quite well adjusted. So they have very good life outcomes. They know how to take care of themselves.
A quick question. Can you explain a bit more of where the ground truth for these measurements come from?
The ground truth comes from a survey, right? The ground truth comes from a personality survey that 70,000 people have taken, between 20 and 100 items. It's the International Item Pool Proxy. It's the formal term for the Costa and McRae Big Five personality model through a Facebook app. So language-based measurement, yes. So I've shown you these language representations. Now we can do the same thing we did for gender again. We can try to capture these language associations in these machine learning models in a cross-validated framework or in a held-out framework. It doesn't really matter that much. Same idea here, Facebook language from people. We apply the language prediction model. We get the estimates of personality. And then in this case, what we did, we compared it against friend reports. So how well a friend can estimate your personality when they fill out a short personality survey about you. So here we have a baseline, which is human observer report, right? So we compare computer report against human observer report against ground truth, which is me filling out the survey about myself. And here are the prediction accuracies for your friend. The R of 0.3 here, I should comment on. It's quite typical in the psychological literature that correlations are this low. So it's generally thought that this is close to the upper bound between correlations between psychological traits or states and measurable behavior. So the fact that your language behavior or your personality behaviors reflect your self-report, 0.3, is sort of congruent with that idea, because how you present through behaviors is a behavior. This is how well our models pick up when they just use your Facebook language. They roughly meet the accuracy of friend reports, with the exception of openness, where they tend to outperform friend report. And there's similar work that doesn't use language, but that uses Facebook likes by Michal Kushinsky and David Stilwell. Michal is also here at Stanford with us. Interestingly, they show a similar bump for openness to experience, which suggests that there's something about openness, again, right, intellect and need for cognition and so forth, that makes it more detectable in your digital traces. So there's words for what it is we leave behind on digital platforms. There's digital traces, digital exhaust, digital footprints, but the idea is that it's a behavioral residue, is the old psychological idea. Going back to dorm rooms, you could take pictures of dorm rooms and estimate the conscientiousness of the people living there. So this was early work by Sam Gosling, which was super influential. And to some extent, this is a modern version of the dorm room idea. So how stable are these things over time? Psychologists think in terms of different metrics of validity. One of them is test-retest reliability. These are the stability of these language estimates based on different 6-month windows of language, right? So that goes to the question of stability. They're about 0.7 correlated over time. And then you see them decay, say over 2 years, you see them decay slowly. And so this has both flexibility component and personality. So personality does change over time. There's measurement error in here, and then there's also, of course, semantic drift. So the way people engage with language changes over time. But this is sort of, it's vaguely respectable here in terms of psychological benchmarks. So 0.7 is generally sort of minimally adequate for a reliable instrument. So I hope at this point, I've certainly given you some indications that you can understand psychological constructs through open language analysis. Keep in mind that we really didn't need to know anything about personality to do this analysis, no? We could just make up a survey, and we've done this in many other ways. You make up a survey, you give it to people, and then you see the words, thoughts, and behaviors that come out of the language that are associated with the thing you're studying. And so you can actually go back and forth between creating a survey and looking at the language, looking at these correlates to refining your survey. You can use the language they use on social media to predict personality scores. We've done this here in language. We've done this here for the social good. Of course, there's been unfortunate stories, say with Cambridge Analytica, where these personality estimates, very similar ideas, were used for micro-targeting of ads, which, by the way, is not as extreme as people think, right? People's brains weren't hacked there. It optimized ad spend by maybe a factor of 2. That's a very optimistic estimate. So it saved somebody some money in ad spend, but it didn't hack people's brains that they suddenly got different ads. It's another commentary, but a lot of that is sort of, you see the correlation coefficients here on the data, right? This is a noisy business, and it works in aggregate much better than it works at the individual level for something like personality. If you had to characterize the personality of a given person, of a single person, and your language prediction models only account for 10 to 15% of the variance that a survey accounts for, there's a lot of noise still left at the individual level that sort of tends to smooth out in the general application to populations. Yeah, and then I hope I've given you some indications that these measurements have some reliability, which is something you want to see in the social sciences for something that looks more like a measurement. To generalize a little bit beyond personality, we've developed work on temporal orientation, future-mindedness, past-mindedness, different kinds of empathy versus compassion. These have different connotations, locus of control, internal versus external, overlaps with notions, say, of agency. We've applied this to stress. And of course, we've applied this to mental health dimensions, depression and anxiety. And I'm gonna turn there next. So beyond these three, I also would like to add that they're versatile. And they're also versatile in one more sense. And this is very fresh. So, right, I showed you this pipeline of how we can extract features from Facebook statuses. We can build this Facebook-based personality prediction model. Now we can take counties. Yes, we can take their tweets. We can represent those tweets as the same set of features, right, topics or some other distribution of features. And now we can apply that prediction model to the tweets. I should say that this undergoes a process of adaptation, right? So we published about this. We call this target side domain adaptation. If you build something on Facebook and you want to apply it to Twitter, you have to, it's a good idea to pre-process your features a little bit to adjust for the language differences between the two platforms. So here's a word that's rarely used on Facebook is RT, for Russia television, presumably, or somebody hasn't figured out that, or uses some client that posts to Facebook and Twitter at the same time. On Twitter, that's retweets, right? So whatever tiny coefficient your model has learned for RT on Facebook will blow up in its application on Twitter, where 80% of all tweets have this in it, or 60% of the tweets have it in it. So you need to compare these frequencies and vector that out. We call this target side domain adaptation. But so once you've gone through this process of due diligence, you can then take geotag Twitter data, right? So data that you've, and we're going to talk much more about this next, where you figured out where that was sent from and get county level estimates, say for personality.
Chaitanya has the question.
Yeah, so my question is how difficult or easy it is to extract topics from tweets given they have very short context. Like for example, when you extract topics from FB posts, so their users can post long enough content. But on tweets, you have very restrictive length.
It's not a problem at all. So Facebook posts are about 14 words in length. Tweets are about 10 words in length. That's enough for vanilla LDA. If you did skipgram word embeddings, you would have to adjust your context lengths maybe. There's a limit of how much context you can get there, but that's plenty for LDA.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So you get the, so this is really fresh. So we're looking at this together here for the first time. This is openness to experience. So language estimated openness to experience. These maps aren't great in part because the fewer people live in a county, the larger the error and the more space they take up on the map. Right, so you get a lot of gray counties here without estimates. But what you can see, if nothing else, is that the coasts lean high openness to experience, and here in the Northeast, New York, Pennsylvania, and so forth, high openness to experience. Does anybody? I don't know if we're going to do this, but does anybody can anybody think of another big distinction in American life that follows roughly along these lines? All right. Sorry, go ahead.
Religion?
Yeah. Religion, but also politics, right? So openness to experience of all the personality traits is the best predictor of being a liberal, of being Democrat, voting Democratic. And to some extent, you can see this here, right? So these are your latte, arugula sort of areas of the country. Here's a different way of looking at this. So here's the highest openness to experience, language estimated openness to experience areas. Portland, so the Portland metro area, Seattle, San Jose, San Francisco, Oakland. Give yourself a high five, that's us. Santa Cruz and Boulder. And then probably the next one here is actually Austin. And then on the low end here, you've got Minneapolis, Houston, some places that I don't know, to be honest. Conscientiousness, the tendency to reply to emails and be very structured. Also sort of correlates with income and so forth. So Fort Collins, Denver, Charleston, Birmingham, and then it's very low for some reason in San Jose, in where we are, which doesn't really make that much sense, and Bakersfield. Extraversion, social reward. We're going to Miami, right? Leading metro area here, followed by Atlanta and New York and Myrtle Beach. Lowest extraversion is Portland. So both introverted and high openness to experience. Think board game nights. I think at that intersection, you're into brewing your own beer and doing board games. So just sort of as a general, so we did a sort of soft version here of pre-registering our hypothesis. We did some predictions about what personality trait should go with what, and then the result there is the language. And you, with the exception of extroversion, everything dovetails nicely. And extroversion was also the one where we didn't agree, because we're pretty extroverted here, I would think, where we live. But this is just, right, this is very fresh. But it shows you how you can scale psychological measurement, and actually begins to solve a few problems in psychological measurement. One of them is the reference group bias. So when you ask somebody, how conscientious do you think you are, what do they do? As human beings, they attend to two reference people left and right of them, and they say, well, I'm a little more conscientious than Tom and a little less conscientious than Sally, and so I'm going to calibrate myself based on my reference group, right? We're not floating through the universe by ourselves yet. And so what ends up happening is that people report lower conscientiousness in areas that are objectively more conscientious, right? So the old joke is, or not the old joke, but the old finding is that if you ask Japanese people, are they very conscientious? They're like, no, I'm not conscientious, compared to the extremely high bar that they have. And the same is true as well. If you're surrounded by very sloppy people, then hitting the minimum bar of, of living a conscientious life, you think of yourself as very conscientious. So we're not really well attuned to global references. We are attuned to local references. Same is true with socioeconomic status. It's much more important how you feel relative to the people around you than you are on some global metric in terms of psychological outcomes. And what this does here is, because language behaviors tend to be a little bit more objective, it gives us some objective base to make these estimates from. But as you can see in the case here of extroversion, these things can also backfire on occasion. But yeah, so this is just a, and there's work now ongoing by Jason Renfro, who's been in touch. Jason Renfro has been sort of leading this geographic personality literature to see if things like county conscientiousness predicts things like COVID adherence. By all indications, it should. Okay, any questions at this point? Now would be a good point for questions. Of course, now you don't have any. Okay, so here's moving right along. So depression. Depression is bad, leading cause of disability worldwide. Interesting, huh? I mean, this is not leading cause of death, it's leading cause of quality adjusted life years. It's underdiagnosed and undertreated. So can we do something? Can we do something with social media to detect depression? Can we speak meaningfully to depression as well? So in this case, we focused on a subsample of 16,000 people who'd taken a 100-item survey. In this case, it covers facets, right? I showed you facets within openness. Now it covers the facets within depression. And because that's a really bizarre measure of depression, I should say. So the first thing we did is validate it against standard measures of depression, the Beck Depression Inventory, or an epidemiological measure of depression, the CSD. As reasonably valid. Here's what I really like about the depression facet. These are these 7 questions here. Some of them are reverse scored. That's what the minus means. If you do exploratory factor analysis, think of it like a rotated PCA. It's a way of just, remember that story I told you how topic modeling is like factor analysis? This is factor analysis. So it tries to load the items onto underlying dimensions. And you see that this nicely, things very rarely factor analyze apart this nicely. And this is in part because the sample is so damn big that it works so damn nice. So you get this cognitive component here of disliking yourself, and you got this low mood component down here, this emotional piece, feeling blue, being down in the dumps, having frequent mood swings. And now if, right, we run it through the pipeline rather than using the personality traits, we now use these facets. And again, I'll show you the most correlated. And before I show you the low mood, I would like you to pre-register your hypothesis, certainly in your mind, of what you think is most predictive in terms of emotions, thoughts, and behaviors about having low mood. I don't know how you're doing on the quarantine, but maybe think about your own quarantine experience. What do you think predicts low mood that you experience on a day-to-day level? Okay. Unclear if rhetorical or actual question. Okay, let's say it was a rhetorical question. It's the word alone. That's the single most predictive of feeling low mood. It's also, of course, words like depression and depressed. They're very rarely used. But we thought this was extremely telling, right? I mean, humans are a fundamentally social species. Our neocortex is designed to attend to social cues with unfathomable precision and effectiveness. We sense status hierarchies in rooms within seconds of entering it. We can make fairly decent estimates of people's personality based on very limited exposure. It's called thin slicing. And we're designed to be with other humans, right? We are a cultural species. We've evolved language. We go through a long grooming process for 9 months where for long adulthood where we transfer culture to our young. And so you take that away, people don't do so well. Low self-worth. The biggest feature here is why. This dovetails nicely with cognitive theories of depression that attribute depression to a sense of meaning and a lack of orientation and the wrong kind of attributions about the world. Okay, I see a question.
Addie?
Yeah, I just noticed that some of like the typed out emojis are in there. I found that very random, and I was curious if you guys had any hypothesis as to why that is.
I don't know. It's a single language feature that's also associated with introversion a little bit. I mean, it is an anguish emoji, no? I should say that unfortunately in this data, we didn't have Unicode. I would love to do this with emoji data, with modern emoji data. Think of this as a first draft of emojis, right? It's an emotive expression.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay. Okay, I could offer further commentary, but I think we'll just go on. So depression continues to be bad. And we wanted to see, so this is all, right? This is sort of nice and synthetic. We got some beautiful data set that we really like. We did some fancy stuff. Medium fancy stuff. We get stuff that's really cool, but can we actually deploy this in a medical context? And so what we've done here, and by we, I mean Penn Medicine, colleagues at Penn Medicine. I was at Penn before I was at Stanford. We approached patients in the emergency room. It's now more than 20,000. At the time of the study, it was 11,000. 11,000 people were approached by actual people carrying actual iPads and asked to consent to share their medical records and donate their Facebook statuses. And by the time people consent into this pipeline and and can remember their Facebook password on the fly to log into our Facebook app, right, which we have in the App Store, which pulls the data from the Facebook API. We get about 10% of those approached. We actually have Facebook language from and medical records. Of those, we found 144 diagnoses of depression in the medical records. So of those, this is roughly, that makes sense. That's roughly the population rate. So by the time you have 1,000, about 144 of those, that makes sense, including some boundary conditions about they're not already in treatment and all these other things. And then we paired them with 5 controls each. And that's actually quite important. So many times when these things are done in computer science, you build these analytic artificial samples where you balance the samples. You find some sample of say 500 people who have said that they're depressed on Twitter, and you balance this with a sample of 500 people who haven't said that. Now you have these nicely balanced classes. You can train your classifiers and report accuracies. That's not how it is in the real world. In the real world, somewhere between 10 to 20% of the population, 8 to 20% of the population, depending on what country, what time, what estimate, what criterion, suffer from depression, some form of depression, diagnosable depression though. So that means if you build a classifier that says nobody's ever depressed, it could be as bad as being 92% correct in the scenario where 8% of the population is depressed, right? So, but it's 80+% correct. So it's by the time you have these very imbalanced classes, it's very hard to beat most frequent class as an estimate of depression. James, are you getting ready to ask me something?
Yes, Sweetie has a question.
Okay.
Hi, I was just wondering if you had any data on how like the proportions of people in each of the personality categories corresponded to like real life proportions of people in each category. And I guess that the reason that I have this question is that I can imagine that there's like a little bit of confounding from people who are naturally more like extroverted, for example, posting. Yeah.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so I should say that they're not in categories, but these are all continuous variables, all variables in psychology, all real variables, with the exception, it's actually a debate as to whether there are even categorical variables in psychology, in all of psychology. But all psychological traits are more or less normally distributed. So we think about mean differences. Are there distortions in the sample? And we've compared baselines, personality estimates in the studies we have with outside samples, and we see differences of up to 0.15 standard deviations, so a tenth of a standard deviation, in the direction predominantly of higher extroversion, as you had predicted. So there are effects, but they're quite small by any standard. And I should say that the penetration of social media is certainly getting so high in the population that the means we're seeing are beginning to approximate the population means quite accurately. There is more commentary. So there's a bit of a stereotype that people on social media are very different than everybody else in the population. And that may have been true. That stopped being true a while ago. Certainly, you have age and gender of people and even their personality dimensions now with our language-based assessments. And so, for example, for Twitter, what we do these days is we post-stratify our samples. So we run them through the same pipeline that Gallup or the census would run their population estimates. We see, okay, are men underrepresented, are women underrepresented? Do we have too many young people? Or do we have too many urban populations and so forth? And then we re-stratify the sample. So we give weights to different people in the sample to make their estimates approximate the population estimates a little better. And for some variables, this makes a difference, life satisfaction in particular. But for many variables, it doesn't. And so I think that's part of the evolving story, that there's more and more people on social media platforms, and we get more and more digital exhaust. Sorry, that was more than you asked, but maybe there was some interest there, which justifies my commentary. So, okay, so we've gone through this pipeline, and now here's how we set up this prediction task. We have a person, we pair every person with 5 controls to approximate base rates in society. We look at the history, we look at the diagnosis of depression that they have. Now we throw away all the data after the first diagnosis of depression. So we only use data that precedes the first diagnosis of depression to avoid contamination where somebody said, I've been diagnosed with depression. There's very rarely happens, but to make it clean, compare apples to apples, right? And so we pair that data with the same time series from 5 other people to make sure that we take into account seasonal effects and Christmas and the time between Christmas and New Year, where people report more depression. If you're lonely between Christmas and New Year, it's a terrible time. Most suicides happen then. So we want to make sure that all of this is represented in the data, and then we train a language prediction model as a continuous prediction problem. So we take the language and we estimate a probability in a cross-validated framework that a particular person is depressed. And then we compare it against the ground truth. does this person actually have a diagnosis of depression in their medical record? And so you have this continuous prediction, and then you have a binary truth outcome that puts you into, that means for every threshold on the probability spectrum where you say the cutoff, okay, anyone below 0.5 probability, we're going to declare depressed, and we're not, everybody below is not depressed. And so that continuous probability threshold against the binary truth, right, gives you sensitivity of specificity that is different for every true positives and false positives. That's different for every probability threshold. So you put this in the AUC space. So this area under the curve where you, receiver operated characteristic. This is this curve originally from the use of radars, which is really cool. But you plot the probability of detection against the probability of false alarm for different thresholds on this probability curve. And this is how well, if you use sort of standard screening surveys and compare them against medical records, this is how well they do. Not very well. I should say that medical records are also not as good a ground truth as one might think. The ground truth for depression prediction is structured clinical interviews. So it takes about 2 hours or so. I've given them myself in an earlier life. It's a decision tree. It's basically a decision tree that you interview the client through as you establish these sort of 9 different symptoms or so, and then you sort of you have some decision rules on how to diagnose a major depressive episode, and then you have a set of specifiers. That is with anxious distress, for example. That is the gold standard in which people who study interventions determine depression status. But this baseline here is a relatively weak baseline, and you see that the Facebook-based prediction model does about as well as this weak baseline. The one beauty of these continuous predictions is that you can pick different thresholds. So up there is a Lex threshold. A Lex threshold is where you optimize for the probability of detection, and you suffer the probability of false alarms. You just want to make sure you raise a red flag for everyone who could possibly be depressed. On the other hand, here on the bottom left, you can use a strict threshold if you want to minimize the probability of false alarm. If you want to make sure that those people who you think are depressed are really depressed, right? So you can sort of trade them off differently depending on applications. So the lax threshold actually has an application in clinical settings when you use these methods for pre-screening. Right, so you pre-screen, you say, here's some signal that this person might be depressed. You give them a screening survey, which have, depending what you use, 0.8 plus sensitivity against clinical interviews, and then you follow up with a clinical assessment. This pipeline here, by the way, has a number of very elegant properties. If you combine different modalities of screening, the errors actually cancel out. Because they're so different, use such different feature spaces, right? Come from different domains. The overall accuracy of like a 3-part classifier like this, think of this as an ensemble of 3 different kinds of classifiers, has very, very nice properties. And so I think that's the way you should think about, one should think about these social media based methods, is that they're really part of an ensemble of classifiers. They're not ready for prime time to be the one that, you score high in our Facebook app and now you get antidepressants. That's not going to happen anytime soon. So, and then the strict threshold, you apply this language prediction model. And now you know that everybody who you do detect is very likely to have depression, and you can vector them directly into something like computerized cognitive behavioral therapy. So a while ago, there was a BMJ paper establishing the efficacy in a randomized control trial of this app here, Beating the Blues. And for a while, at least, it was used as the frontline treatment for light to moderate depression by the National Health Service, which is the health system of the UK. So in principle, you have a pipeline here, right? I mean, you can build a classifier, then you have a scalable digital treatment modality that costs you $100 a pop, which takes all the low and medium cases of depression and moves them back into the everybody's doing fine category, which allows you to triage your intense talk therapy and psychiatric resources for those who are very depressed, which is nice for something that is so underserved as depression. But the big question here, it's not actually about how do you build the language model. The big question here is, how do you build systems of care that integrate this? How do you align incentives between doctors and health systems and insurances? How do you deal with liability? What if somebody in the system knows that somebody might be suicidal? Like, what happens with that information? And this is part of the reason why social media companies such as Facebook are often very hesitant to run these classifiers on people, because then they're also in some sense liable, because they now have that information about these people somewhere in the systems that can be discovered during discovery in a legal proceeding. And so Facebook, for example, last time I talked to them or had an understanding, had some visibility into this, decided to only do this classification at the post level, to only mark posts as identifying depression or suicidality, and then following up, say, with apps or a note about a helpline, but not maintaining that information in their database as a trade level assessment of people. Okay, no questions. So here's what this looks like as an early warning system. So here we take language from 6 months windows that goes further and further in time before the first record of depression in their medical record. And you see that the closer you get to the actual diagnosis of depression, the more this language-based probability goes up over time. Sort of a nice property. We actually have to thank a reviewer here, Matthias Mehl. Was a reviewer on this paper, and he asked for this during the review, and that was really great idea to do this. What does the language look like? This is just the top 10 topics. So we model 200 topics in this language space. We only have order 1 million Facebook statuses in the sample, so we model 200 topics. Yeah, there's a longer story about how many topics you should model. If you're interested, you can also email me and I'll send you a review. But it covers exactly the same, roughly the same thing that we saw in this synthetic Facebook study. You see just depressed mood, you see the hostility again, you see rumination, you see markers of loneliness, right, as we talked about, but you also see the clusters that make sense in the medical context. So we know that people who are depressed that show up in emergency departments tend to seek out a lot of treatments. They're heavy users, and that's part of the rationale why we might want to detect mental illness in people who use emergency services, because what we really want to do is we want to deal with their mental illness outside of the emergency department and save the hospital a lot of money, because very often they don't get reimbursed for the care they provide. All right, summarizing. You can use it as a rough screening tool and at the individual level, right? All of this was at the individual level. So it's quite a hard task. Early warning in principle is possible, and the language shows specific symptoms. So there is a universe where between visits, say, some app sits on your phone and collects all your data and de-anonymizes it and just runs these sort of symptom-specific classifiers on it. And then you present to the clinician, and there's actually a dashboard of different symptoms, right? So your clinician gets a dashboard, a digital health dashboard, and says, hey, okay, you haven't been sleeping well, and your communication density with other people has broken down or something like that. So rather than say, oh, you have a certain probability on the depression score, what's clinically generally more interesting is to say, okay, here are symptom clusters, because then that's the unit of analysis that a clinician can engage with. You can then say, is the symptom this? Do you have insomnia? Something else, right? I mean, this is, I think there's a future world in which this is all a little more integrated. And I already talked about this, right? So we integrate this with other modalities, with phone sensors, with feeds that aren't as fickle as social media feeds. And of course, there's ethical questions, right? Because now you had somebody's Facebook language that they donated to you because they want to be helpful, but now you've run these classifiers on it, and now your social media history has become protected health information. And now what, right? I mean, so what we did is in a HIPAA framework, and we're obviously extremely compliant and closely supervised by IRBs. But you can imagine how you might not want your insurance company to know what your neuroticism or depression scores are, because they might price products against you or something like that. So there's legal frameworks are needed, I think, is the big takeaway here. All right, let me hold for any questions.
Yeah, I had one question kind of on the depression note, that you were talking at the beginning how depression is very underdiagnosed, and it seems like here gold standard that you're comparing against is a clinical diagnosis. And so I was curious if you guys had like considered any other standards to compare against, or whether that was something you had taken into account.
I mean, the gold standard question in depression is a very fundamental one that's touched upon by a number of different fields. So one of them is the sort of research domain criteria idea, or the RDocs. The idea is that there's these transdiagnostic processes that all have neural correlates, say, that are implicated in things like depression and anxiety. We're not at the point where we've looked at any other kind of ground truth than either clinician assessment or surveys. I think probably the best thing to use, the hardest ground truth that I think is agreed on in psychopathology research, is the structured clinical interviews by a clinician. Note that that's very different than clinician assessment, right? So the clinician assessment that was the ground truth in this study is that you meet with a doctor, and the doctor gets the sense that you're depressed based on expert judgment. And you can make of that what you will. That's not a structured clinical interview. A structured clinical interview takes 2 hours. Nobody can pay for that outside of psychopathology research. Yeah, but we haven't yet.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's see, time check. Yeah, okay. I hope you're still bearing with me. I know this is a long talk. I hope you all had a coffee. Okay, heart disease. So talking about communities. James, were you about to say something?
No.
I can always hear when you unmute yourself. So, so this is, yeah. Okay. So this is, now we go from individuals to communities, right? And I already did this sort of en passant when we got to the personality predictions of communities, but now let me do it full on. Depression is the leading cause of disability. Heart disease is the leading cause of death still. Mortality rate per 100,000, around 600 per 100,000. Leading cause of death. I can't convert it on the fly to COVID, but more than COVID, by any stretch of the imagination. COVID is very serious. Please, that's not what I'm saying. But you know, heart stopping is also very serious. Right, so in this case, we have mortality statistics from the Centers for Disease Control recorded as the underlying cause of death on death certificates. Not perfect, but a pretty hard label as far as labels go. Also, death is a very unambiguous endpoint. Very often it pays off to work with hard endpoints where there's no ambiguity and less reporting error. So in this case, this was the case here with heart disease mortality. In this case, we use a data set of 150 million geotag tweets. I'll have a few slides coming up here that talk a little bit about the geotagging and the sort of Twitter processing. But that means that you started with about 1.5 billion tweets to get to 150 million geotag tweets. So these are large corpora. And the first code to do the geotagging that our consortium used was actually written by Srinidhi 10 years ago, who's also on this call. So thank you, Srinidhi. When he worked at Penn 10 years ago with us. So we do this language analysis pipeline. We say, okay, what's the language that's most associated with heart disease mortality? You have language that looks like interpersonal tension and hate, right? You have language that looks like hostility and aggression, the cursing again. And you have things that look like boredom and fatigue. This is not having a reason to leave your bed in the morning. It's not a good place to be in. So I should say that in the 70s, there was this very cute theory about heart disease called type A personality. This is a chestnut of psychological research. So I think the backstory was that there was some cardiologist, and he noticed there were two kinds of people coming to his practice, right? It's always you always, hold on to your wallet if anybody says there's two kinds of people. But there are two kinds of people or actually three kinds of people, but two major kinds of people: type A personality, type B personality people. And he classified them early on by type A personality people would sort of scratch his chairs, and type B personality people wouldn't do this. They would just sort of chill. And he noticed that the type A personality people would die more from heart disease. And so these days, that was a good first draft, but these days we think about this a little bit differently. So type A personality, today we think of as really two elements. One of them is hostility, so the tendency to experience negative emotion. The other one is time urgency, so being very busy, right? Busy, busy, busy. Time urgency is actually protective against heart disease. Time urgency is the opposite of this here, right? Time urgency is like, okay, gotta get up, gotta get coffee, gotta do X, gotta do Y. Hostility is this here. Hostility is the tendency to experience negative emotions. Negative emotions, in case you didn't know, are really bad for you. They flood your system with hormones. They arguably roughen up the inside of your arteries and make it easier for platelets to stick. They put your system into chronic arousal. Your system diverts resources away from long-term immune repair and cell repair to fight or flight, right? So the hostility piece is real, definitely, in this literature. And so, okay, so going from higher risk to lower risk, this is at the community level, right? So you see markers of higher socioeconomic status. Socioeconomic status isn't just making more money, but it's predominantly more education, higher education. And it's also, as one researcher who calls this being member of the creative or super creative class. So if you're a knowledge worker, you're also somewhat protected against heart disease by the rich ecological correlates of heart disease, right? All of this is correlational. I should say that the people dying in communities from heart disease are not the people tweeting. This is the crazy thing about this working. And I'll show you more about how this is working in a second here. But these are people in the communities that people are dying from heart disease. So people in the communities are sort of like canaries in the coal mine that just sort of, represent how much road rage there is, how much green spaces there is, what the income level of the community is, what the norms are around smoking. This gets represented on Twitter. And then independently, the people 60 plus who are at risk for heart disease mortality are actually dying, and the overlap between them is probably nil. So it's a instrumental variable. It's a proxy variable for the community context, which is something that the people who study the effect of place on health have always been saying. But it's really cool that it comes out in this sort of bizarre Twitter line of research. Okay, lower risk. Sorry, I'm editorializing. So lower risk, higher socioeconomic status, positive experiences. This is a lot of social stuff. Right, picnics, weekends, doing things with other people. There's a hypothesis in the heart disease literature called the social buffering hypothesis. It means that even if you have a number of risk factors, biological risk factors and psychological risk factors, as long as you have other people around you, they protect you against some of that risk. So they buffer against heart disease risk, hence social buffering hypothesis. And we know this, for example, for studies where you put people in scanner and show them scary cues, and then you repeat the whole thing, but you have a loved one hold their hands, and the fear response goes down dramatically as soon as you have human touch and connect to other people. So this is again hitting on the theme how important other people are to our psychological and biological experience. Finally, this is optimism. We can quibble as to whether this is optimism or agency or goal pursuit, but these are resilient people. These are highly structured people. These are people who have grit, which longitudinal studies quite separate from this work that came out at the same time have also identified as a longitudinal predictive factor against heart disease mortality, particularly cardiovascular heart disease mortality. This is atherosclerotic heart disease. There's subtypes of heart disease mortality, myocardial infarctions. Coronary artery disease is the leading subtype of heart disease in terms of mortality. Okay, so I've shown you the language story. I think you get with the program here. Let's do this prediction version of this, right, where we encode all that language information. And I would, and I told this to our adherence team, prediction is not a bad thing to do, even if you don't care about prediction, because what prediction does, it gives you an estimate of how much of variance of X is contained in target space Y. So even if you're not trying to solve the prediction problem, running it as a prediction task gives you an estimate of how much variance is contained in this space. And if you do it this way, I recommend just doing a very robust method of doing prediction. Don't kill yourself with BERT and super fancy machine learning, unless you really want to solve the prediction task in a precision health context or something like that, then go for it. But if you're just trying to do this as a social scientist, you're trying to say, okay, how much variance here is contained? Use something like topic models with rich regression, something that's very interpretable, not very likely to overfit, that you can back engineer and explain. But yeah, so let's do this prediction task. We have the tweets of communities. We apply this language prediction model. We get an estimate of heart disease. We compare it against the CDC's given values as the underlying cause of death and death certificates, and we compare the accuracy. So on the left is death certificates. On the right is just using Twitter for these estimates. Decent overlap. Some areas are off. Many areas are on. What does this look like numerically? This is now nationwide. I showed you Northeast because it's easier to look at areas where counties are the same size. Here's how well demographics do predicting heart disease. Here's how well health risk factors do: smoking, diabetes, hypertension, obesity, predicting community heart disease rates, heart disease mortality, income and education, socioeconomic status, still the most important. Here's how well a model does that combines all of these. Here's how well only Twitter does. And this was 2009, 2010 data. So, and then if you combine, did I include it? No, but if you combine Twitter and all these other predictors, you don't actually get a bar that's any longer. So it's indistinguishable from only Twitter. So what Twitter does, we think, is it picks up all this other variance. It picks up income and education, right? Remember the language clusters. It picks up socioeconomic status and all of these other, and of course, demographic distribution. And then it adds a sliver, right? A small sliver of psychological variance. So things that are only really captured in Twitter, that things like hostility that exist over and above socioeconomic indicators or broad health indicators. And then we recently replicated this with completely fresh data. So this is 2012, 2013. The variables here on the same order. You see, if for some reason, obesity has become more predictive. And so we see the same. The Twitter performance is unchanged, right? So it goes from 41% or something to something like, 0.42 correlation to 0.43 correlations. But it's basically the same correlation. So Twitter, the predictive power of Twitter doesn't change. But the predictive power of some of these other baseline variables has changed a little bit. So, okay, so I think, I hope to have impressed upon you the idea that Twitter language is sort of like opening the window into the psychosocial community of context of communities. Again, there's an epidemiological literature, a public and urban planning literature that has been saying this for the longest time. This is not something Johannes discovered. But it's nice to see that it comes out, and we had really good feedback from those audiences, in part because it was cool for them to see this sort of in the big data in the technical space. And then on occasion, for certain outcomes, Twitter actually captures more variance than other models. And we are still working, we have been working for 6 years on a paper that does a version of this for all the leading causes of death in the US, not just heart disease. And trying to figure out which ones in particular Twitter is particularly helpful for. And my rough takeaway is that Twitter is particularly good, and you would have never guessed this, but Twitter is particularly good at capturing things that have a psychological etiology, that have a psychological component. So things like life satisfaction or self-harm or more psychological forms of heart disease. Atherosclerotic heart disease is more psychological than other kinds of heart disease. That's really where we see these methods shine, I would say. By the time you're using Twitter to predict cancer, you don't tend to outpredict income and education as predictors. There are proxies for all sorts of environmental exposures and lifestyle and so forth. So the more psychological something is, the more social media, I think, is able to pick up on it, which seems obvious in hindsight, but nevertheless took us 5 years to understand. Okay, and then this is a side story here. I wanted to throw in for the adherence group, but James has just unmuted himself. So, what we?
Austin has a question.
Oh, hey, Austin.
Hey, Johannes. I just had a quick question. For any of these heart disease models, have you tried doing forecasting for like reported heart disease, like for if you only have the Twitter data like the month before the CDC stuff is released or anything like that?
Yeah, we have. The problem, we've played around with it. It's a nut we haven't cracked, in part because past heart disease is such a damn good predictor for future heart disease.
Fair enough.
So heart disease correlates 0.85 over time with itself.
Like change in heart disease or something.
Yeah, the problem is generally, if you go to the second moment, so the moment when you're trying to predict changes on social media to changes in heart disease, the noisiness of the estimates really works against you. So that's why we haven't managed to crack that nut. Andy Schwartz, close colleague, Stony Brook, part of this larger consortium here that we've been working on for 10 years, has done a lot of work trying to do this, and as far as I know, has managed to crack that nut. Andy, if you hear this, I'm sorry if I misrepresented this. But Austin, I actually have this slide in here for you. Good moment to unmute yourself. So this is just a quick plot here. So on the left here is socioeconomic status. So this is education in this case. Predicting heart disease. This is how well education predicts heart disease, right? The more education, less heart disease. Sorry, this is the full variable name here, underlying cause of death, I-25-1. And then you can do these mediation bits here, where you language estimate a psychological variable, right? So that's the hypothesis. And Daniel here in the psychology department has also been working on this. He just left us for a postdoc for the University of Chicago. But the idea is that in between your structural economic variables and your medical outcomes, there are psychological variables, and you can use language to estimate, say, anxiety. And then it mediates roughly the same amount that you see in other studies, which is about a quarter. So we see these language-based psychological county variables mediate about a quarter of the path between SES and heart disease. Yeah, anyway, so this was just a side story. We haven't published this, but just in case somebody was interested about doing mediation work at the county level, we have some indication that it works. I hope this was helpful, Austin. I don't know why it had it in my mind that you care about this, but I had it in my mind, so so I put it in. So right, so I'm now going to repeat this here. And I'm going to repeat this for Gallup surveys for subjective well-being rather than heart disease. And so 2.1 million surveys over 8 years, Gallup has been calling between 1,000 and 500 people a day for the last 8 years. So we aggregated all that data and to get labels, county level labels for life satisfaction. And we compare this against our language models. And then we compare it against income. And here's a rough version of this. So income is an incredibly strong predictor of life satisfaction by any psychological standard. That's why economists like it, is my sense, because it basically behaves like income in a lot of cool ways. That makes a lot of sense to them. But basically, right, I mean, you're catching on to my drift here. Twitter picks up the same variance, more variance in life satisfaction than income does as a structural predictor. And then in this case, combining income and Twitter actually gives you a nice boost. And now look, I mean, this is a super simple model, but we're beginning to hit 0.7 here in our prediction of life satisfaction at the county level. That's beginning to be really good. It's beginning to be to the point where you can say, hey, can we estimate county life satisfaction for counties that Gallup just can't poll? Gallup has also stopped polling counties. Their well-being tracking poll, they've stopped as of 2018, which is a shame. But it gives us enough training data to train these Twitter models. And so this is work we did a while ago. So we estimated life satisfaction for every county in the US based on, sorry, this is not life satisfaction. This is a slightly different construct that correlates 0.7, 0.8 with life satisfaction. It's positive emotion engagement relationships, meaning and accomplishment, called PERMA. Is one construct among many, multidimensional construct, but again, it's one factor really. And we've also worked with people in Spain, with a bank in Spain, to reproduce this in Spain. And we've also, one of the cool things of doing this stuff that has more policy implications is that over time you get to work with really cool people who do this at a government level. So this is INEGI, Instituto Nacional de Estadística y Geografía in Mexico. They're awesome. I'm very, very fond of them. And we worked with them for a few years, and they started building their own geotagged Twitter data set by mostly focusing on the 2 to 3% of the random Twitter feeds that contain GPS coordinates. And if you do that, you end up, this exists for the US, and this exists for Mexico as well. These are all the major roadways, right? So this is Mexico City here. You can all find Mexico City. This is Cancun up here, top right. Maya Rivera down there is Tulum, it's all the hippies. This is Cozumel here, great diving. Puerto Vallarta is up here. Hello, American tourists. This is Tijuana up here, right? So you can see all the sort of major roadways. This is Los Cabos down here, really nice. But when you do this, when you query this particular Twitter API, you actually do it as a bounding box, as a square bounding box. And so this is the US, right? This is Texas up here. And one thing that INEGI realized by just collecting this data, they actually got a fairly sensitive indicator for cross-border traffic, right? So they got an indicator that scaled with how many people cross the border by just looking at how many Twitter user accounts cross that boundary. And then something else INEGI has done with this approach that I think is really cool is they looked at tourism flows. From where to where are people traveling in Mexico? And they also looked at sentiment changes around tourism. Like, did it make them happy to fly to Cancun? Right, so there's a main, right? This is the main axis here is Cancun, Mexico. La Ciudad de Mexico. So what it shows you, right, if nothing else, is that this big data collection and this sort of processing through language models or just the geotagging gives you another feed of what's happening in a population. And in the US, this is often secondary to other feeds, right? In the US, we have Gallup and we have the behavior risk factor surveillance system by the CDC. But in principle, this is a technology that scales into situations and contexts where, say, this government data is not available. Or can be imputed. And that's particularly if you think about more commentary, but you think about the global south, if you think about who's going to be impacted by climate change, who needs this measurement, right? And of course, now in the time of COVID, been meaning to reach out to them to try to coordinate measurement of well-being impacts around COVID. These become really cool and critical technologies, and they're less cavalier perhaps than they seem if they're in this purely synthetic context over here, where you publish in a human-computer interaction conference and then don't do anything with it, right? So a summary policy, you can proxy measure psychological variables, some of them really well. You get resolution down to about the county level. We haven't. In principle, if you only use GPS coordinates, you can of course geotag down, say, to the zip code. But the county level is sort of is currently the level of comfort, I would say, in terms of data density and geotagging pipelines, which works really well for us now in the COVID world because the county has become the essential unit of analysis. And then finally, you can recreate these methods in different languages. You can't actually translate these language models. We have an EMAN-P paper that tried to translate these prediction models to Spanish, but it doesn't work that well. You're better off getting training data in your original language, and then recreating these supervised machine learning models. And that's because language use is entirely cultural. Most of the variance in language use is cultural. So what I mean with this is that a family to a Mexican means something different than it does to an American. And it has a different association with well-being, right? And famously in Mexican countries, the association is much stronger between the social domain and the well-being domain. Okay, so high-level construct, high-level summary before I get a little more in the nitty-gritty in terms of how some of these methods work, in terms of Twitter processing. So we can use social media to understand differentiate psychological constructs. We can measure psychological states for populations and individuals. And in principle, we can work with, we can inform policy. We can click this into a policy context. We can, in principle, see if a particular policy intervention leads to a certain change in some of these psychological variables in a way that's easy to measure, scales in principle. But lots of devils are still in the details about how you calibrate this to make it really, really dependable. So there's lots of noise, particularly coming out now, that use the random 1% of Twitter and just run a sentiment analysis model of it, and try to see how Twitter sentiment is changing as a function of COVID. It seems to predict the opposite of what we know from government data sets and how mental health has been developing. So it's not as simple as doing it. You have to build these different kinds of samples. You have to attend to, you have to try to build cohorts, follow people over time, look at their demographic composition and so forth. It's just, you have to be a little more serious about how you structure these data collections to do it well. Okay, so now, mostly for the benefit of everybody who works with Twitter data, I wanted to sort of introduce two things here. The first, I think, what I wanted to introduce is something that I'm very fond of, which is a classification of counties into different subtypes, into different community types here. And this is a clustering based on socioeconomics, based on demographics, and based on culture. This is on AmericanCommunities.org, led by Chinny. It's not richly published on yet, this classification. We just published a little bit on it. I think there is a book that describes this, but we've test-driven. There's a number of different ways of clustering counties into subtypes. There's a sort of 11 Nations project, which says, oh, these are German immigrants up here, and then here they're French, Caribbean or something. It doesn't work as nicely. This is of all the ways of clustering counties into larger groups, types of counties. This is my favorite. And here's some unpublished stuff, just looking at life satisfaction by these community types. So LDS enclaves, Latter-day Saints, right? These are Mormons. So Mormons lead the US in life satisfaction. Mormon counties lead the US in life satisfaction. Again, ground truth here are Gallup phone surveys, aggregated to the county level and then mapped onto the American Communities Project. And look who's at the bottom of this list, right? It's evangelical hubs and working class country. We just published a paper in JPSP that shows that expected life satisfaction 5 years from now was the strongest predictor of who voted for Trump over and above Republican baselines. So low life satisfaction is one of the best predictors we have for voting for, we think, both populists and anti-incumbents, which was true in the case of Trump. And if you look at this here, you see the story here, right? Evangelical hubs and working class country is who voted for Trump. Notice that big cities here are sort of near the middle, but positive north of the mean. So life satisfaction scales with income and education. Big cities here are sort of, big cities and urban suburbs, of course, nicer towards the top. This is happiness, so this is an emotional measure. Look who's winning again, it's the Mormons. Look who's at the bottom again, evangelical hubs and working class country. But look at who's now at the bottom of the list here, big cities. And this is sometimes called the happiness paradox of cities. So people in cities are actually very satisfied, high income, but they tend to also have more stress and not have a big diet of joy, right? A positive emotion diet. They don't experience much joy. And we see this here in this data. So here's a different way of looking through this, of looking at this, mapping happiness against life satisfaction. You can see that there's a general trend, and then there's these off diagonals, right? So there's the Mormons at the top, and then there's sort of evangelical hubs, working class country, rural middle America at the bottom, low population density areas. And then you have this off diagonal here, which are the cities where people are satisfied but not happy. And then you also note you have these special type communities here, which are sort of neutral at happiness, college towns. College towns are interesting. They also have the highest rates of drinking in the US. It's a really curious subpopulation of counties in the US. But I'm mostly showing this. This is stress. I'm also showing you stress here. The Mormons are also the most stressed. I don't know why. There is some hypothesis that it has to do with who picks up the phone in Mormon households. I don't know. But Mormons also endorse stress quite highly. And big cities, again, are high here on stress. I'm mostly showing you this to familiarize yourself with this ontology for all of you who work with county data. It's already in the CSV I've given you. I just wanted to sort of sell it to you a little bit as something you might want to be looking at. When you think about adherence about these community types, I think that's really low-hanging fruit. And as you can see, we've had really, really productive findings just running it through this ontology. Then next point, let me hold for any questions in case there's any questions.
There was one from Chaitanya.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I wanted to know, like, how did you get the geotag data for the tweets?
Yep, it's coming up.
Okay. Okay.
There's 3 slides. I don't know why I'm burying the lead here so much. You know what? Why don't I do this real quick? So here is, thanks to Trinity who put the numbers in this morning, here's Twitter processing. So we started, for COVID, we started scraping a data set across 30 or so Twitter handles. So Twitter, you have to register an account with Twitter with a phone number. And apparently it's gotten harder, that you can use to poll their 1% random feed, which you get for free. And doing this since February to a week ago, 10 days ago, we assembled a data set of 250 million tweets that all match a list of COVID hashtags across 10 or so hashtags, where we refined it a little bit over time. And then we clean it. So if you want, we call this the raw data set. If you wanted to work with the spread of misinformation or something and wanted to track how much stuff gets retweeted, you might want to work with that data set by itself. What we have then done is removed retweets and replies, and users that had more than 500 tweets. Users, and I'll show you a plot here in a second, but users who have more than 500 tweets tend to be a different population than the vast majority of people in the data set, right? They're super posters, they're bots, and so we've thrown them out. And so if you remove retweets and replies from Twitter, you actually reduce your data by 80%. And you're getting closer and closer to what a Facebook status is, right? It's something that you just post that importantly also doesn't contain a URL. So we do this in the next step. We also throw out everything that is just sharing a URL. So now it's Twitter all the way down to just people not responding, not replying, not retweeting, not sharing. And so you've gone to 17 million tweets here on the right? So you started with 250, now you're down to 17. So 7-8% or something. And then we run it through this county tagging pipeline, giving us a final sample of 1.2 million. We now call them statuses, but they're they're tweets that have the status characteristic of not being reshares. How do we do the geotagging? We look at so 2 to 3% of tweets contain GPS tags. I think it's actually more like 1 or 2% now that phone permissions have become more restrictive with the latest versions of phones. So of course, if we have GPS coordinates, we take GPS coordinates of tweets. But then what we use is the location field in people's profile. And we've written this pipeline where we try to map the location that they give onto a county. So if they say something like Scottsdale, we look at, if they say Scottsdale, Arizona, we look up where Scottsdale, Arizona is and we're good, right? We have the county. But if they just say Scottsdale, we look at all the possible Scottsdales in the US, and we assume that this person is randomly drawn from the population of Scottsdales by population. And we say, if there's a more than 90% chance that this person is drawn from one particular Scottsdale, say Scottsdale, Arizona, then we map it onto Arizona. Otherwise, we throw the person out of the data. So it's quite a lossy pipeline. It manages to geotag. Historically, it was about 10%. I don't know what's, so right now it seems like it's closer to 8% or something like that. But to get to a clean geotag data set is quite a lossy enterprise. Right? You start with these huge data sets and then you get all the way to those. I should say, I should say that we've made 10% county tagged, county language. So we've made 10% of Twitter between 2009 and 2015 aggregated, available at the county level. So we've extracted all the language variables at the county level based on the 10% across those 6 years and shared that on our GitHub page. And the slide here is coming up in a second. In parallel to working with the 1% COVID data, you can also just get 100% random tweets from Twitter. Get 1% random tweets. And as an order of magnitude here, these are 750 million tweets collected over the last 5 months, which we and many other labs have been scraping, in our case, for a decade. So the 1%, many labs are scraping the 1% in the background and storing that away for further processing, geotagging, and so forth. Geotagging is generally done on a Hadoop cluster, but maybe Trinity will re-implement it in a cloud in a way that's higher performance. But that's the sort of data situation with Twitter, and that's also the data situation in the tables that our Twitter teams are working with. Let me pause for questions in case there's any questions. Okay, so I've managed to talk for quite a while, actually. So, okay, I'm landing this plane. I promise I'm landing this plane. In case you're curious, this is the temporal density, right? So sometimes these collection pipelines go down, servers go down, and you have these drops here in collection. So these are raw tweets over time in the raw data set that you have. You see it's 4 times e to the 6. Trinity, you generally want to do this base e, sorry, base 10, so it's easier to interpret. But yes, base e. And this is how many tweets, so write messages, documents, generic term for tweets. This is how many tweets we have per user on a log scale. And you see why we cut off here at 500, right? Because that sort of peters out. In this particular data set. And this is just a shout out. If you want 10% of county Twitter at the county level, based on 1.5 billion county map tweets. So it means 1.5 billion, that's this step here, right? This is 1.5 billion. So we started with at least 15 billion tweets over that period that were geotagged. But they haven't been cleaned, right? So the cleaning in terms of removing retweets and replies and dropping URLs is something that we only started actually maybe half a year ago. And when I ran COVID results, early COVID results, I saw the language signal to be quite a bit better if you try to isolate sort of original posts that have this trait. The name of the game here is always finding the signal in the noise, right? To the extent that you can process your data in favor of finding signal in the data that is dependable and isn't rubbish, that's good. That's something you should do. And it's something that, for example, isn't happening when people do these random 1%. If they just run sentiment analysis here on the 1% all the way here at the bottom, it doesn't look good, I can tell you that, in part because it hasn't gone through any sort of care. And what we haven't talked about here is how do you follow people over time so you get the same sample over time. You're aggregating over with in-person variance over time. I think that's the cleanest way to do it. And we're just preparing those data sets for COVID. So github.com/wwp, WWVP. It's all our language models. It's well maintained. You can pull it. Thanks in large part to Sal Georgi, the lead research programmer at the UPenn group, who's been shepherding this quite well. And then, okay, final piece here. But I wanted to just flag something to you. So there is a temptation, and in part, of course, you should always start with the simplest method. I mean, do it dumb first is a really good law of research. So there's linguistic ingredient word count, has this positive and negative emotion dictionaries. So what you see here are positive and negative emotion dictionary frequencies against these variables on the left that are from Gallup. And so that's on the ground truth here. Notice that the positive emotion dictionary from Luke, when applied to the county level, correlates the opposite against ground truth, right? It goes exactly the wrong way. So don't do it. Don't use Luke positive emotion to estimate happiness for communities. There's papers in the literature that have tried to do this and have gotten these results, and then have really strained discussion sections trying to make sense of this. There's other approaches. There's an older set, effective norms of the English language, ANU. It doesn't correlate when you apply it to Twitter and then compare it to ground truth. Doesn't correlate. PERMA is something we did a while ago, correlates okay. And then there's another model by colleagues I really respect called LabMT that's based on annotations. So people were given words and asked to annotate words, like, do you think this is a positive word or this is a negative word? And then you get this dictionary, and then you correlate it with ground truth, and it correlates, this should be positive, right? So it correlates negatively with life satisfaction. So using dictionaries at the county level is a dangerous game, unless you really know what you're doing. And we just published a paper on this. You can read our paper. Let me just go to this. Data-driven models work. So if you use data-driven, supervised machine learning-based sentiment models, that's Swiss chocolate here, or person-level models, right? So we gave people life satisfaction scores and we got their language and we trained a model. Or you do direct prediction. This is different, right? You already use the Gallup data as the outcome in a cross-validated framework. These supervised machine learning models work. They use the entire vocabulary and they learn the associations, and they tend to be quite robust. Word level approaches, even if it involves annotating single words with a lot of annotators, in the case of ANU and LabMT, does not. Why does it not work? Well, here's for example, in the case of Luke, here's all the language that correlates as predicted. So words like fun, excited, great, exciting. These words are in the positive emotion dictionary, and they correlate the right way with ground truth, in this case with happiness. Could have used life satisfaction, same idea. But look at the stuff that correlates negatively with happiness. It's the words love, lol, good is in here as well. These are sort of NetSpeak words to some extent. Lol on Twitter does not actually convey joy, it turns out. And they also seem to be words that are used more by lower education areas of the country. So there's different ways. This is a hypothesis, but it's something we landed on after doing this for a few years. Is different areas of the countries have different ways of engaging with Twitter. And what you pick up on when you at this NetSpeak language, lol, love, and so forth, are lower, more urban areas with worse health outcomes that use Twitter more in the way that you and I might use texting. Much more relational context, much more boyfriend, girlfriend sort of stuff, much less information, much more sort of private life. And then suddenly the language that's more private generally ends up being a marker for those communities, and thus inherit a negative association with, say, lower happiness, but also higher heart disease. So we first came across this in the heart disease work. And we've actually mapped this across states. And it also seems that this NetSpeak language is used more in the South in the US. So there's a cultural difference in language use. And so you end up, if you use these dictionaries, they end up picking up on these larger geographic divides in the country in a way that then inverts your signal. And what we've done here, and to just test this hypothesis, and let me just show you, I've taken this out here, but at this point might as well. Right, so if I show you, here's the sort of full, once you remove as few as 3 words from these dictionaries, you end up fixing the dictionary. So you end up removing these correlations. So language is incredibly dependent on frequencies, and these NetSpeak words are highly frequent in language. So they're a very potent source of false signal. If you remove them, you can improve the performance of these dictionary-based approaches, but arguably you shouldn't fiddle with this, and you should go to the supervised machine learning models to do inference of communities. Okay, and now I'm going to stop. Believe it or not, I had more content, but I'm going to spare you. So thank you for your attention. If you have any questions, please ask.
Thank you very much. That's really terrific. Any other questions? I would be curious if you could say a bit more about what in your mind are the most interesting surprises that come from these word association analysis. So are there particular word associations that come up from Twitter, for example, that runs counter to this psychology literature previously believed?
Basically not. Perhaps that is the surprising thing. So even in these data-driven explorations of depression, you know, this is a completely atheoretical way, other than using sort of a standard survey. It's a pretty atheoretical way of testing depression, or trying to figure out what thoughts, emotions, and behaviors go with depression. And we were surprised, or I was surprised, how many of the DSM criteria, the statistical manual for the diagnosis of depression, how many of those somewhat bizarre criteria, right? Psychomotor agitation, weight loss, weight gain, a little esoteric, we could actually find in this case, Facebook data. To the extent that we've seen things that are highly counterintuitive, we've generally been able to identify confounds, and the moment we throw these confounds in the equations, these things tend to stabilize. What the social media analysis do that traditional analysis don't is they give you a rank order of importance, right? So they actually give you a predictive estimate of what is more important for something, right? So in the case of depression, you know, loneliness is in there as a correlate determinant of depression, but it wasn't clear. It's not clear necessarily from the depression literature that it's the most important one. So that's sort of nice. It's sort of what these data-driven analysis do is they foreground certain aspects over others, and they sort of situate them in respect to one another in a way that I was surprised when I showed some of these word clouds to, I remember Diane Chambliss at Penn, who's this wonderful and very experienced depression researcher, and she said that, you know, Diane, what's up with all the cursing in these depression word clouds, right? Is that real? She was like, yeah, I mean, that's one of the main things that actually ruins the increase in hostility that you see in this cursing. It's actually something we see in couple work with depressed couples. So one member of the couple is depressed as something that sort of ruins relationship quality. And that's not something, that's something that we know from clinical experience, but that's not generally how depression is generally conceptualized, right? Depression is more of a reduced arousal sort of thing. So anger and hostility doesn't really fit. So yeah, so that's been sort of, it gives you this nice original lens on these phenomena that you can then try to integrate with what the subfields or subdisciplines think about it. The other thing that's been really, perhaps one thing here that I thought was surprisingly powerful. If you only measure one thing for communities, measure the relative use of the word excited versus bored, right? This was not I wouldn't have told you this in advance, right? So words like bored and tired, but just use bored against words like excited, right? Those two will give you quite a sensitive marker of community well-being. And you use two words. We're now doing work we're trying to formalize this a little bit in feature importance and ablation studies and yada, yada, yada. But the fundamental intuition is that you actually need to know very little about a community to get an estimate if people are doing well. Which is sort of nice and goes back to the 1960s theories of how humans work, which is that there are fundamental needs, and if they're properly addressed, right, need for cognition, need for autonomy, need for competence, then people generally do well. You also, right, Maslow's hierarchy of needs is also in that ballpark. So I think as these methods mature, we're able to sort of more and more actually inform psychology with these findings, as opposed to just sort of cashing out the sort of big data technologies for another prediction study and another prediction study. Yeah.
Awesome. It's super interesting and super informative. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you all for listening to me nonstop for such a long time.
Thank you.
Have a good day. Have a restful weekend.
Right.
Take time out.